I believe we're recording now.
Oh wow! Excellent, I say.
Till the card fills up.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the December meeting of the new Sheridan Club. A few parish notices before we start. Coming up this Saturday, we have the new Sheridan Club party, of course. Journey to the centre of Vauxhall. A Jules Verne theme. The usual silly games and splendiferous raffle prizes, and the lucky dip, of course. 11th to 12th of December, there's a candlelight Christmas party. Tickets still available?
There are, both nights, yes.
Excellent. 15th December, the new Sheridan Club virtual pub quiz via Zoom. And 21st December, we have our Christmas moot at the Rising Sun in the Barbican. All these details in the newsletter and on the webinar site. Those of you who are on Facebook will notice that we're busy selling off Fruity Hatfield Peveril's possessions.
It's not a punishment, you understand.
To raise money for a good cause for his goddaughter's college fund, I believe. So if you're interested, go on New Sheridan Club Facebook page and you will see many wonders to buy.
And those of us, incidentally, those of you who have bought things, I have a pile of things to hand over to you, and to others as well. So don't go home without taking my hand.
The first meeting of the new year will be on the 5th of January, where the Duchesse de Saint-Gène will intrigue us on the subject of the mysteries of the lutenist life, historic memories of the most delicate instrument ever.
Maybe something different, you can't decide.
Oh, right.
She was here.
I vote for the lute.
Maybe we should just vote.
I like a lute.
Anyway, and now to tonight's talk. Sam will talk about ancient Greek music and other stuff. Thank you, Sam.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's been a while since I was here, so it's lovely to be back and see you all. And yes, especially for a topic that some might say is rather obscure. To give you an idea of how obscure, I was drinking once in the Oxford Union Bar. Yes, I'm sorry to any Cambridge graduates, but some of us managed to go to a proper university. And I was approached by an undergraduate, and he asked what I was doing. I think they swarm these undergraduates.
That kind of bar.
I'm afraid, yes, you know. I thought for a second I'd attracted an entirely all-male audience. You know, that was a bit tautological, an entirely male audience, and my line was doomed. So thank you so much. I'm hopeful. So, and this little fellow walked up and perched on the bar and said to me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, ancient Greek music." "Oh," said he, "do you have XYZ as a supervisor?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, well, I've never understood how you can do any of all this. I mean, after all, we don't have any music, do we?" And I said, "Well, actually we do. We do have some sheet music." "Oh, yes," said he, "but we can't understand the notation." I said, "Well, yes, we can, actually." "Oh, how?" "Because we have musical grammars that tell us how to read it." "Oh." So it's lovely to see you here for such an obscure talk. But before I go on, I just have to quickly, as it is the NSC, we want to get away with it. You see, these things are wonderful. Now, I can tell you any old hogwash, and you won't be sure whether to believe me or not. Now we're going to talk about the famous Kitharodopos, the lyre that lady initiates in the Temple of Aphrodite welcomed returning soldiers with, playing it with their feet. Yes. I'm getting laughs. Right, so we'll begin. Yes. Now, we're tempted to think of the classical world perhaps as silent. We don't really think of music. I mean, I suppose I'm a musician myself, so I might be biased, but if I'm thinking of any particular point in history, generally there's a soundtrack at the back of my mind. I don't know if anyone else has that. Clearly not. But we don't tend to think of this when it comes to the ancient world. Is this the laser? Oh yeah, wow. So basically, contrary to what we might think, music was ubiquitous throughout the ancient Greek world. It was everywhere. Most of what we tend to think of as poetry was better described as lyric, actually. They were sung. And in fact, the rhythmical element survives in these. So I don't know how many of you did poetry, but ancient Greek and Latin poetry, but there's a system by which you can work out the beat of any given line. So to give you a famous example from Latin, the first line of the Aeneid, which is the tale written by Virgil of Aeneas, the founding father of Rome, leaving Troy and founding the Roman race, is Ama virumque cano Troiae qui primus ab oris. But it scans, there is a set of rules that essentially fix how we ought to enunciate this. So it's actually Ama virumque cano Troiae qui primus ab oris. And that's the sort of epic.
Greek Latin.
Eh?
Greek Latin.
Exactly, yeah. The standard epic rhythm. So that's not necessary to say that every poem had a proper tune. But probably the current theory is that they would improvise on a set scale, maybe. And especially in Greek, Greek has a set of pitch accents. So whereas we're used to talking in a stress accent, so I'm going dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum, and I'm enunciating it like this. The Greek would raise and lower the pitch of his voice. So, is that so?
Enunciation.
Indeed. So you might be familiar with the famous episode in the Odyssey, Odysseus fleeing from the Cyclops. Well, he might not seem quite so frightening when you realise that in Greek he is actually the Kuklopes. So, anyway, based on this, an academic in the early 20th century found step tribes, I can't remember his name, I can find it, I'm sorry. They encountered step tribes who sang their epics, essentially, just in this way. They would improvise on a set of notes, and they chant them, really. A bit like, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with church chant, Latin church chant.
Never heard of it.
Never heard of it, no, I'm sure. But that's to take a plain chant tone, say, and sing a rather important hymn to it. You essentially, I'll give you a demonstration. You would sing, "My soul doth magnify the Lord."
But it has an international.
Indeed,
voice.
yes. And my spirit hath rejoiced in God, my Saviour. And I screwed that up. But the important thing is it's it's all a question of getting structures of the line. So based on the tone, you can sort of tell where you are in the line. It's not a tune per se. And I had a clip of music to play you at this point, but it was on my gadget. Clayton, can I access a web browser?
Maybe.
I mean, I guess because otherwise I'm just going to have to go. And I was going to play you some music now, but this is the one that wasn't in the presentation.
International is good.
Yeah.
So, right.
Don't you ever any history, Clayton?
All of them. Well, not without getting out of this. I mean,
Oh dear. Oh, have I paused? Oh dear.
can't run both at the same time.
I would say with technology, stick with what you've got. Tom and Toby.
We ain't got much.
Do the hot
So what did you want to?
No, I think you're on the web browser.
Well, there's one running.
There's one running. Great.
Okay. Now we want to go.
Oh, actually, hold on a minute. Now I've made you do that. I can just play it on mine, can't I? Why don't I just do that? That'd be easy.
Why not?
That'd be brilliant, isn't it? Ow. Right. Sorry about that.
Can we get behind?
Well, we hopefully. I mean, it would have been easier just to have a set of slides, a sort of slide projector and a record player, really. But then I'd need to get the records, and I don't. That is the one advantage of the internet. I don't really think anyone would make sort of singles of a couple of academics singing their reconstructed version of an Homeric chant. Right, there we go. Okay, right. Connect. Yes. No. Thank you. Oh, we're getting to them. We're getting to them. They're coming. Right. There we go. Okay. So there are a couple of Austrian academics. I'll be back. Oh, thank you. And where have I put them? There it is. Right, great. Who have sat down and essentially they've treated these pitch accents as though they're indicative of a tone like that. So let's listen to them singing a little picked from the Odyssey. This is Book 8 and it's Demodocus the Bard and he's singing a song about Ares and Aphrodite, who had a bit of an affair, you see, and Ares was caught rather ignominiously by her husband in a net.
Is that as loud as all
That's
goes?
as loud as it goes. So there you are. Now you probably don't want to listen to 5 minutes of that, but that gives you an idea of
the club mix!
We're going to have it on as a backing track after I finish.
We can include the whole lot in the end.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So that's just what you get when you treat these pitch accents as sort of intervals and sing along to them. So, and now I've forgotten what I'm supposed. I suppose I could just look at there, but it's more comforting if I look at there. So yes, that's what you get. Now, in addition to that, we have instrumental music. There's a variety of instruments, musical instruments, and we'll look at those later. And just about everything they did was accompanied to music. If there was a temple sacrifice, there'd be wailing on the pipes. If there was a symposium, posh word for a drinking party, basically. Drinking with a bit of philosophy, you know, with the odd acrobat.
Much like this, you mean?
Like that. Yes. Except we don't have sorts of girls jumping through rings of fire. I think that's something to consider for the next one.
Health and safety.
Well, if it means putting the subs up.
So, yes, there we are. We have systems of choral and instrumental notation. They survive and they're based on a modified alphabet. I will terrify you with that later on. The notation was often lost in the process of transcription. And, well, again, we've touched on the fact that there's a modern habit of thinking that Greek culture is primarily literary, when in fact orality was just, if not more important, simply because we judge these things by what we've got left. So, to give you some idea of why this musical notation was lost, that's not a brilliant resolution, is it? Essentially, take my word for it, that is Greek writing there, and just above it is a line of intermittent squiggly characters that look a little bit like letters. So there's your writing, and there's your intermittent squiggly characters, and there's another line of writing, and then okay. So you can imagine, even if this wasn't essentially like a bit of scrunched out tissue paper, if you're a medieval monk who's copying this stuff, and you see that, you might copy the text, but you're probably not going to spend all this time writing out this musical notation when you don't have a clue what it is. Now, building on the sort of sense of misapprehension,
Yes.
that's a very good example. We have a couple of chori, and they're a bit before our era, but don't think too hard about that. They're basically statues of young women, and you can see they're quite old because they have that sort of fixed pose that you'd often associate with Egyptian statues, maybe, but they are Greek. And
With
you
a
can
funny smile.
with a funny smile, yeah. And there were male equivalents. There was the choros as well, and he would stand with his funny smile. This is how we've received them essentially, but that is how they were. We can reconstruct the painting based on sort of traces that have been left. So we think of classical antiquity in general as this sort of cold, sterile place, perhaps, full of imposing buildings, all very proportional, all white and clean, when in fact it really wasn't.
Yeah, it's all bloody Winkleman's fault, isn't it?
Well, yes, but yeah. But
It's these blasted dead Germans.
they are the Germans, but we get Germans later on.
That's a minute. What kind of Germans are these?
So, yes, there we are. Now, in terms of survivals, there are fewer than 30 known, and by that I mean published, because I have no idea what, these, I don't know, Spanish nobility might be keeping in their castle libraries, but there are fewer than 30 known surviving documents which contain Greek melodies. They're very fragmentary. Only 3 composers are directly credited. One of those, it is a hymn from Athens, and it is actually chiselled. It's chiselled into it's an epigraphic inscription, so it's been chiselled into a wall, and he's credited there. Another one, we have a writer who says that he is the chap who wrote that bit of music, so we know from that. And the third, he is again mentioned in the documents, and we also have other people who say what he wrote. And they're small. They're not usually more than a minute in each of these.
You actually get a degree course out of all of this.
I know, but you see, nobody does it. You see, so when you put the gown on, you see, and I've said you can say whatever piece you like, and nobody knows. When they came to mark me, all they could say was, "Well, it looks all right, but I think an expert would have to mark it." And luckily for me, the only real expert was supervising me, so he couldn't mark my papers. Oops, so much as if I planned it, isn't it? And yes, longer fragments tend to be choral. The instrumental ones we have aren't very long. We have one trumpet signal from Eleusis from the early classical period, so that's about 500 BC, a little before, like my memory serves. And we have a couple of instrumental exercises, so almost like scales, little things that they've been told to play and they've just been scrawled down a bit of parts. So, we have more theoretical texts. Joy of joys. And you thought you were going to come here and listen to some nice ancient Greek songs. So, we have major theoretical primers, which is how we can interpret this notation, and why little Mr. Undergraduate was being a bit dim, to say the least. Most important of these is probably Aristoxenus of Tarentum. And he wrote the Harmonica Stoicheia, which is elements of harmony, basically. And that's a general sort of, well, actually, no, I'm going into detail, so I won't tell you about it now, because I'll get to the next slide and I'll say, I've already done that. Next one we have is a chap called Claudius Ptolemy, who was writing a little later. And then we have a chap called Aristides Quintilianus, who was writing rather later. We don't know how much later, but he refers to Aristoxenus, so he must be after him. We have a guess at about AD 300 because he writes to one of his pals in his book, and the name of one of those pals, well, he writes to a couple of his pals, but the name of one of those pals wasn't really used before AD 300, so that's a fairly good guess. And then finally we have the magnificently named Anicius Manlius, and by golly he was Severinus Boethius. And he was a late Roman courtier, and yes, we'll more on him later. So, there's old Aristoxenus. Generally what he's concerned with is scales and tuning. So imagine you have your lyre, which you are going to see a little later, and you want to know how to tune it. Because don't take for granted that they have our scaling system for a second. So he essentially tells you how to tune your lyre, how to get different effects, what those different scaled modes really do, and gives a general theory of music. This is what music is for, sort of thing. That's obviously not a period representation of him, but I thought it was rather nice. It gives you something to look at, That's even less period. That's supposed to be Ptolemy, and I can tell you for a fact he looked nothing like that, but there you go. it's written there, so it must be true. And he was a mathematicus, as you can see. He was a mathsy type who essentially came along and tried to make what Aristophanes had done more mathematical. It was to bring in the use of ratios, to make adjustments so the whole thing hung together. He had different ideas on how to tune your lyre. So essentially he's a little bit of a revisionist. Did anyone ever care about his revisions? Who knows? We don't know. There is some evidence to say they might have. We'll be getting to that later. But we can't really know. He's almost trying to bridge Aristophanes to people like the Pythagoreans, who you've probably heard of, sort of the famous mathematical cult, really, because for them, mathematics and that sort of thing, ratio, proportion, geometry, really had spiritual, religious overtones. Now we have Aristides Quintilianus. I wasn't able to find a photograph of him, so you just have to. I took a lot of time to do just get the yellow just right, you know. And essentially, all he does, he reproduces Aristophanes and supplements that with another chap from his sort of time. So he's quite interesting because we can say, okay, he's clearly compiled more than one writer, so we can sort of tell from that Aristophanes probably wasn't a complete he wasn't a maverick, really. It's probably a pretty standard theory, or it wouldn't be in a compilation. And then we have Boethius, from imagination to stark reality. That's his tombstone. We'll find out why later. And he was a late antique courtier, a philosopher, general bighead. And he attempts to use what is by then poorly understood and frankly disappearing music theory of earlier writers for his own purposes, talking about the universality of music and essentially philosophical questions of how you could access sort of the nature of creation through looking at the ratios between scales. Why do I say it was disappearing and poorly understood? Because he got it all wrong. If any of you are familiar with musical modes, as we would describe them now, i.e. church modes, they have the names of the old Greek modes, but they do not correspond to them in any way. They're essentially an invention, well, if they're not an invention of old Boethius, they're after the fact, they're around his time, maybe a little before. They are not the modes of Quintilianus about 100 years previously, 150 years. He was sainted after being executed by Theodoric the Great, who was the Ostrogoth king of Italy, I suppose, by then, immediately after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Although that wasn't terribly dramatic, that was essentially just all of the Goths in the army saying that they weren't going to listen to the emperor anymore, and their sort of general. Does anyone remember his name? I can't remember his name. There was a general. The Magister Militum in the West was a Goth, and I'll pick myself. Anyway, he essentially walked up to the emperor, patted him on the shoulder, and said, "I think it's time you resigned, old boy." And the emperor said, "All right then," and went to a villa. So it wasn't very dramatic at all. They kept all the governmental stuff, which is why you have chaps like Boethius, who was a sort of senatorial class doing what they had always done. They loved him in the Middle Ages. He translated lots of Greek into Latin. In the Middle Ages, knowledge of Greek wasn't terribly widespread, but they could pretty much all speak Latin, if they were read, more importantly, Latin, if they were fairly well educated. So they loved him, very influential, and again, he's why these modern church modes exist. Now, why theory matters. It's like a really boring beginner's music lecture. Theoretical texts that we have can be used to reconstruct the scalar and the tuning system. So I suppose scalic might have been better. So essentially, if you're looking at how to tune your lyre, if you tune a lyre in the way it tells you to tune a lyre, you can go, right, it makes those sounds. That's what they are on a modern in modern musical notation. You can reconstruct it. They help you to decode musical notation because essentially what they do is most of the time they'll tell you what the note is. So they'll give you the, this is how I understand it, by the way, this wasn't really my specialism, this side of it. No. Should have checked before I came and gave a talk on it. Really in the spirit of the club.
Really, no.
And essentially what I think goes on is that these theorists say, tune your lyre to this note, they give you the symbol, but then they also describe the ratio between that and the previous one. So that's really all you need. You don't really need absolute pitch, and you can work that out pretty much based on, well, A, how high and low someone can sing, because they wouldn't have been writing notes and they wouldn't have been able to sing, and again, how high or low an instrument can play. They also provide you clues as to ancient music's intended effect. They will talk about different modes, think scales in modern parlance, and the effects that these are supposed to have. So, this chap is called Michael Levy, and he twangs his kithara. A kithara is that thing there. It is essentially the last and most complicated incarnation of the Greek lyre, and it goes twang. You can see there are pins there. By the way, if anyone wants me to do another one of these where I bring these things in, I'm more than happy to. You just have to, I'll take my hat round for a collection, and then I can. That's what we'll do. I mean, there's a firm in Greece that makes them. You know, you can buy your authentic reproduction of ancient Greek instruments. You can see there we have those tuning pegs, which adjust the tension of the string, thereby tuning it. Some of the later examples have little springs on the top, and you can use those springs to wobble the top, which essentially gives you a bit of vibrato. It makes it go like that.
Whammy bar.
Exactly. And you can see he's plucking individual strings with his left hand, whilst strumming with a plectrum on his right hand. And what they would probably do when they were accompanying, say, a piece of some music is they would pick out individual strings with their left hand, while perhaps also doing a little bit of tuning, because as anyone who plays a string instrument will know, if you cut that string in half, pinch it, you will go up an octave, things like that. So essentially they pick that out with the left hand, and then in between, while essentially the singer was taking a breath, they go. Could you start that video, please, Clayton? Let's have a listen to it. This is him mucking around, essentially. Well, he's not mucking around. He's improvising on a mode, a scale, the Greek doi.
Are you sure you're going to hear anything?
It's turned off.
Is it?
We muted. We may be muted.
That means it's not allowed to make any sound for some reason.
Oh, thank goodness for that.
Thank you all very much. That's it. Talk's over. I can play it on mine again. I mean, I won't have to fiddle around the internet this time.
But no, I'm sure we can have a link.
There's no mute button, is there? I mean, I would expect it to automatically cancel.
It may be thinking that
It's got to output through the
projector or something.
projector, yeah.
Well, I mean, if you
I
want
wasn't allowed sound with my talk, so I think that's a precedent, really.
sound, output. Yes.
Oh, it's going
There we go.
Now we go back.
Oh,
And you still can't hear me.
we've got to start the presentation. Oh no, there you go. Sorry. There you go. Apple do better speakers than HP.
You say that.
Well, no. No, false alarm.
It's quite quiet.
It is rather. I mean, they're not loud instruments. You'll find there's a great drumming. So that's him strumming. And that's him talking about himself, basically. Or writing about himself. I've got to pad it out.
Wait till we get to the chorus.
Good riff.
So he's just essentially just going up and down the scale and fiddling about on it.
It comes a bit late.
Noodling.
Noodling, yeah. But it sounds it doesn't sound much like classical music. So perhaps some people might say it sounds
like in a-
Eastern.
Like in a minor key.
No. But yes, I know why. Yeah.
It does sound a little bit like Middle Eastern string.
So it sounds like an oud.
An oud, yeah. Well, the arrow bit, the scale the arrows use is quite close. This is essentially, if you were to go on to sit down at the piano keyboard and play E to E without playing the F sharp. And they reckon scales, I mean, I'm anticipating this a bit now, but they reckon scales in 2 tetrachords of 4 notes each, which span the octave, and they reckon them downwards. So, but let you finish. And I'll sing you a scale when you want me to put it back on. You've been waiting for me. Anything to shut him up. See, he's recapitulating his melody there. Recapitulation, that's very good, that is. Mozart would have approved. Well, there's not necessarily anything precious about these things, you know. I mean, that wasn't the electric guitar of its day. We are going to meet the electric guitar of its day after this. So, essentially, while they reckon scales was 2 tetrachords of 4 notes each, so essentially this scale would be, you would render it la 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 la, dee da da da, like that, essentially. Very odd. If you were going to go up, dee 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 dee, that would be how we would play a scale. So that's weird. And they all have different characters because we're used to exactly minor and major modes. There are only 2 modes in modern music, and no matter which key it is, it will always sound the same if it's major or minor. But essentially, think of it like that each mode is starting on a different note of the piano keyboard, but they have no sharps or flats. So every one sounds different. So, that's your Keitha. Is there anything else I need to tell you about that? Oh yes, let me give you the mythic sort of tale of its invention. So all these things have sort of myths about how they were invented. And according to this, this, as I said, is the latest incarnation of the Greek lyre. Before that they had something called a chelis, which was a sort of a tortoise shell, and they used that as a resonator and little strings. And apparently that was invented by Hermes, according to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, after he had, well, it's real Wikipedia fix this, after he'd pinched his brother Apollo's cattle, and in restitution for that he gave him the lyre, and Apollo decided he liked it and got a music, you know. Anything else? No. Right, now, oh, hello. Oh, does this play that? Oh, wow, it starts them up automatically. Wow. Oh. Okay. Now, this is the electric guitar of its time. You don't believe me? Well, those are called alloy. And the aulos is essentially, think of it as a very angry oboe. Barnyard plus. Now, according to Pindar, Athena discovered this thing and she made it because when they never say they invented it, they sort of say they discovered it, they found it in Greek. And she sort of invented it as a way to reproduce the wailing of Medusa's sisters after Perseus cut her off. Quite why she wanted to do that, I've no idea. And she decided she'd had enough of it when she saw herself playing in the mirror, and as you can sort of see on that vase painting of the Owlatrix, you can see that she's having to pucker up because you need to really put some pressure into this thing. So apparently she saw herself in the mirror while she was playing it, saw it made her look ugly, so threw it away, and it was then picked up by a satyr, one of those half goat, half men fellows, you know, called, what was he called? Marsyas, there you go. He then had a contest with Apollo as to who could play.
You want to got flayed?
Yeah. After losing a contest with Apollo, a musical contest essentially, because Apollo, you see, had his new lyre, and he was able to sing while he played it. So, wow. And some say he was also able to play it upside down, which he couldn't do with his Aulus, because of course the reed was in one end. If you blow down the other end, nothing happens. So apparently, either that or he may have played out of tune is another version of that. And in shame, he asked himself that he be flayed alive, because he was so disappointed in himself for missing that note. Well.
Yeah, that's some self-esteem.
Very shame that lunch should offer the same.
Yes. I mean, I can empathise, really, being a church organist, except it's everybody else that flays you when they're you never have the chance to ask for it yourself. So, apparently, according to Plato, he was turned into a wine skin. Very fitting end for a satyr, isn't it, being a wine skin. So, this chap is called Stefan Hagel. He's one of those two Austrian academics that I played that little bit of Homer. They were recreating that at the start. He's one of those, and he's going to tickle the Aulus. Is this going to work?
Why is he in a prison?
I don't know. Well, I think it's like these.
Yeah, we haven't heard it yet.
Like the church. Could you do the honours, please? It does it when I don't want it to. When I do, it doesn't. He's a doctor too, so he must be clever. This thing might be a bit louder. Check on. Sequence. Could you pause that, please? And I'll see if this is a bit more ordered. Thank you.
Sounds like a Chalamet.
It is rather. Oh, that's an advertisement. No, ignore that. No, I don't want to buy your.
Looking for ladies in there.
Well, I don't know. Right, here we go. This might be. Yeah, there we go. That's better. And as you can see, it's
Or even a crumpon.
yes. It's a free reed. Free reed. It's very soft. It's very soft, yes. There's more going on there. It's more overtones. So there you are. And he's just doing a similar thing to the last chap, just improvising up and down modes.
Must put that on to get me to sleep at night.
It's a shame the readers of Resign won't be able to hear that,
Isn't it?
when the article's published.
I know.
Oh, you can bit audio.
Don't push yourself.
We need to do a CD, CD. I'm sure the royalties won't be. But yeah, what they often did, because you need to, it can get quite tiring putting the required wind pressure into the thing is that they would often wear a little leather strap around the backs of their heads. Often see that in competitions. Usually they were chaps, because sort of the Audi as opposed to the Aulatrix. And yes, just to keep them in the right position. I was talking to someone who's quite mad about these things. He does a lot of playing on them, and essentially he was saying that it really makes a huge improvement because it holds them at the right angle in the right way, lets you keep the pressure up without having to worry about what you're doing. So yes, you can see that is not a chap, she is a flute girl, and they are stock characters. Apparently it was sort of very saucy playing an Outlaws, I think, because they crop up everywhere. They're sort of accounts of dinner parties, they do what they're doing, accounts of dinner parties, saucy vase paintings. That's not a saucy vase painting, but there were some, but I thought better not immortalised. And in one play of Aristophanes, a comic poet from about this sort of time, one of his a dinner guest, who's essentially, I think he's inherited some money, I can't quite remember the exact circumstances, but he disgraces himself by getting thoroughly tiddled at this symposium rather than just lightly drunk, because you must remember that the Greek watered his wine. They didn't drink it neat, they would water it. And so if you got tiddled, you were being a bit barbaric. And yes, he gets utterly tiddled and he makes off with the flute girl. And he's met sort of running down an alley with carrying this flute girl. So yes, it's the old comedy. One of them starts with a chap riding to heaven to see the gods on the back of a giant dung beetle. It's not particularly sophisticated stuff.
Valerie Leon was in that one.
I remember that.
I'm going to have to stop grinning and pointing, and a lot of the time I don't have a clue what you're on about. I just try to play along. Right, okay. So, the other one is, as I've told you how they were supposed to have been made. The other one I don't have a picture of, but the thing you were probably hoping to see, and I'm afraid you're not going to, is the syrinx, the panpipes. Yes, which are really rather boring. I mean, no funny tunings, they just sound like panpipes.